In John Brown's last written statement in prison, before he was hanged, he said, quote, "I, John Brown, am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." End quote. Ralph Waldo Emerson, not an activist himself, said at the execution of John Brown, quote, "He will make the gallows holy as the cross." End quote. Of the 22 men in John Brown's striking force, 5 were black. 2 of these were killed on the spot. 1 escaped, and the other 2 were hanged by the authorities. Before his execution, John Copeland wrote to his parents, "Remember that if I must die, I die in trying to liberate a few of my poor and oppressed people from my condition of servitude, which God in his holy writ has hurled his most bitter denunciations against. I am not terrified by the gallows. I imagine that I hear you, and all of you, mother, father, sisters, and brothers, say, quote, 'No, there is not a cause for which we, with less sorrow, could you see die.' End quote. Believe me when I tell you that though shut up in prison and under sentence of death, I have spent some happy hours here, and I would almost as lief die now as at any time, for I feel that I am prepared to meet my Maker." John Brown was executed by the state of Virginia with the approval of the national government. It was the national government which, while weakly enforcing the law ending the slave trade, sternly enforced the laws providing for the return of fugitives to slavery. It was national government that, in Andrew Jackson's administration, collaborated with the South to keep abolitionist literature out of the hands and out of the mouths in the southern states. It was the Supreme Court of the United States that declared in 1857 that the slave Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom because he was not a person, but property. Such a national government would never accept an end to slavery. By rebellion, it would end slavery only under conditions controlled by the whites, and only when required by the political and economic needs of the business elite of the North. It was Abraham Lincoln who combined perfectly the needs of business, the political ambition of the new Republican Party, and the rhetoric of the humanitarianism. He would keep the abolition of slavery now at the top of his list of priorities, but close enough to the top so to be pushed through temporarily by abolitionist pressures and by practical political advantage. Lincoln could skillfully blend the interests of the very rich and the interests of the black at a moment in history where these interests met, and he could link these two with a growing section of Americans. The white up-and-coming, economically ambitious, politically active middle class, as Richard Hofstadter puts it. Thoroughly middle class in his ideas, he spoke for those millions of Americans who had begun their lives as hired workers, as farmhands, clerks, teachers, and mechanics, floatboat men, and rail splitters, and he had passed into the ranks of land farmers, prosperous grocers, lawyers, merchants, physicians, and politicians. Lincoln could argue with lucidity and passion against slavery on moral grounds, while acting cautiously in practical politics. He believed, quote, that the institution of slavery is founded on injustice and bad policy, but that the promulgation of abolition doctrines tend to increase rather than abate its evils, end quote. Put against this Frederick Douglass's statement on struggle or Garrison's, quote, "Sir, slavery will not be overthrown without excitement, a most tremendous excitement," end quote. Lincoln read the Constitution strictly to the meaning that Congress, because of the 10th Amendment reserving the states powers not specifically given to the national government, could not constitutionally bar slavery in the states. When it was proposed to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, which did not have the rights of the state, but was directed under the jurisdiction of Congress, Lincoln said this would be constitutional, but it should not be done unless the people in the district wanted it. Since Most there were white. This killed the idea. As Hofstadter said of Lincoln's statement, it, quote, breathes the fire of an uncompromising insistence on moderation, unquote. Lincoln refused to denounce the Fugitive Slave Act publicly. He wrote to a friend, quote, I confess I have to see the poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lips and keep quiet, unquote. And what he did propose in 1849 as a congressman a resolution to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. He accompanied this with a section requiring local authorities to arrest and return fugitive slaves coming into Washington. This led Wendell Phillips, the Boston abolitionist, to refer to him in years later as, quote, that slave hound from Illinois, end quote. He opposed slavery, but could not see blacks as equals. So a constant theme in his approach was to free the slave and to send them back to Africa. In his 1858 campaign to Illinois for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln spoke directly, or differently depending on the views of his listeners, and also perhaps depending on how close it was to the election. Speaking in Northern Illinois in July and Chicago, he said, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things, and unite as one people throughout this land, until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. Now you see a common theme with how politicians speak, what they say, what they do, and this is a perfect example of, depending on what state you go to, what the community is like, what that town's like, you want to tweak your message so that you sound appealing to them, because if you use the same rhetoric, you could turn off voters and risk losing an election and decreasing popularity. 2 months later in Charleston, in southern Illinois, Lincoln told his audience, quote, I will say, then, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. Applause. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters of jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and as much as any other man, I am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Behind the secession of the Southern from the Union, after Lincoln was elected president in the fall of 1860, a candidate of the new Republican Party, was a long series of policy clashes between South and North. The clash was not over slavery as a moral institution. Most Northerners did not care enough about slavery to make sacrifices for it. Certainly not the sacrifice of war. It was not a clash of peoples. Most Northern whites were not economically favored, not politically powerful. Most Southern whites were poor farmers, not decision makers. A Bank of the United States. The slave interests opposed all of that. They saw Lincoln and the Republicans as making continuation of their pleasant and prosperous way of life impossible in the future. So, when Lincoln was elected, 7 Southern states ceded from the Union. Lincoln initiated hostilities by trying to repossess the federal base at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and 4 more states seceded. The Confederacy was formed. The Civil War was on. Lincoln's first inaugural address in March 1861 was conciliatory toward the South and the seceded states. Quote, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no jurisdiction to do so. End quote. and with the war 4 months later, when General John C. Fremont in Missouri declared martial law and said slaves of owners resisting the United States were to be free, Lincoln countermanded this order. He was anxious to hold the Union slaves states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware. It was only as the war grew more bitter that casualties mounted, desperation and war heightened, and the criticism of the abolitionists threatened to unravel the tattered coalition behind Lincoln, that he had begun to act against slavery. Hofstadter puts it this way, quote, like a delicate barometer, he recorded the trend of pressures, and as the radical pressure increased, he moved toward the left, end quote. Wendell Phillips said that if Lincoln was able to grow, quote, it was because we have watered him, end quote. Racism in the North was as entrenched as slavery in the South, and it would take the war to shake both. New York blacks could not vote unless they owned $250 in property, a qualification not applied to whites. A proposal to abolish this, put on the ballot in 1860, was defeated the 2-1. Although Lincoln carried New York by 50,000 votes, Frederick Douglass commented, quote, the black baby of Negro suffrage was thought too ugly to exhibit on so grand an occasion. The Negroes were stowed away like some people put out of sight their deformed children who company comes. Quote. Wendell Phillips, with all his criticisms of Lincoln, recognized the possibilities after his election. Speaking at the Tremont Temple in Boston the day after the election, Phillips said, if the telegraph speaks truth, for the first time in our history, the slave has chosen a president of the United States, not an abolitionist, hardly an anti-slavery man. Mr. Lincoln consents to represent an anti-slavery idea, a pawn on the political chessboard. His value is in his position. With fair effort, we may soon change him from knight, bishop, or queen, and sweep the board. Applause. Conservatives in the Boston upper classes wanted reconciliation with the South. At one point, they stormed an abolitionist meeting at the same Tremont Temple shortly after Lincoln's election and asked that concessions be made to the South, quote, in the interest of commerce, manufactures, and agriculture, end quote. The spirit of Congress, even after the war began, was shown in a revolution. It passed in the summer of 1861 with only a few dissenting voices. Quote, the war is now waged for any purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights of established institutions of those states, but to preserve the Union. End quote. The abolitionists stepped up the campaign. Emancipation petitions poured into Congress in 1861 and 62. It may not next year. Wendell Potter said, quote, Abraham Lincoln may not wish it, he cannot prevent, and the nation may not will it, but for the nation cannot prevent it. I do not care what men want or wish. The Negro is the pebble, and the cog wheel, and the machine cannot go on until you get him out. End quote. In July, Congress passed a Confiscation Act, which enabled the freeing of slaves of those fighting the Union, but this was not enforced by the Union generals, and Lincoln ignored the non-enforcement. Garrison called Lincoln's policy, quote, stumbling, halting, prevaricating, irresolute, weak, and besotted, end quote. And Phillips said Lincoln was, quote, a first-rate, second-rate man. An exchange of letters between Lincoln and Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Times, a tribute, in August of 1862 gave Lincoln a chance to express his views. Greeley wrote, this, I do not intrude to tell you, for you must know already that a great proportion of those who triumphed in your election are surely disappointed and deeply pained by the policy you seem to be pushing with regard to the slaves or rebels. We inquire of you, as the first servant of the Republic, especially charged, and preeminently with this duty, that you execute the laws. We think you are strangely and disastrously remiss with regard to the emancipating provisions of the new Confiscation Act. We think you are unduly influenced by the counsels of certain politicians hailing from the border slave states. Greeley appealed to the practical need of winning the war. Quote, we must have scouts, guides, spies, cooks, teamsters, diggers, and choppers from the blacks of the South, whether we allow them to fight for us or not. I entreat you to render a hearty and unequivocal obedience to the law of the land. End quote. Lincoln had already shown his attitude by his failure to countermand an order of one of his commanders, General Henry Halleck, who iron-baited fugitive Negroes to enter his army's lines. Now he replied to Greeley, Dear sir, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do it also. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Yours, a Lincoln. So Lincoln distinguished between his, quote, personal wish and his, quote, official duty. When in September 1862, Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, it was a military move, giving the South 4 months to stop rebelling, threatening to emancipate their slaves if they continued to fight, promising to leave slavery untouched in states that came over to the North. That on the first day of January, A.D. 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of any state that people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforth and forever free. Thus, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued January 1st, 1863, it declared slaves free in those areas still fighting against the Union, which it listed very carefully, and said nothing about slaves behind Union lines. As Hofstadter put it in the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading, end quote. The London Spectator wrote concisely, quote, the principle is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States, end quote. Limited as it was, the Emancipation Proclamation spurred anti-slavery forces. By the summer of 1864, 400,000 signatures asking legislatures to end slavery had been gathered and sent to Congress, something unprecedented in the history of the country. That April, the United States has adopted the 13th Amendment declaring an end to slavery, and in January 1865, the House of Representatives followed. With the proclamation, the Union Army was open to blacks, and the more blacks entered the war, the more it appeared a war for liberation. The more whites had to sacrifice, the more resentment there was. Their liberation. The more whites had to sacrifice, the more resentment there was, particularly among poor whites in the North, who were drafted by a law that allowed the rich to buy their way out of the draft for $300, and so that the draft riots of 1863 took place. Uprisings of angry whites in northern cities, their targets not the rich far away, but the blacks near at hand. It was an orgy of death and violence. a black man in Detroit described what he saw: a mob with kegs of beer and wagons, armed with clubs and bricks, marching through the city, attacking black women, men, and children. He heard one man say, quote, "If we are to go killed up for Negroes, then we shall kill everyone in this town." End quote. The Civil War was one of the bloodiest in human history. Up to that time, 600,000 dead on both sides, and a population of 30 million. The equivalent of the United States of 1978, with a population of 250 million, of 5 million dead. As the battles became more intense, and the bodies piled up, as war fatigue grew, the existence of blacks in the South, 4 million of them, became more and more a hindrance to the South, and more an opportunity for the North. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction pointed this out. These slaves had enormous power in their hands. Simply by stopping work, they could threaten the Confederacy with starvation. By walking into the Federal camps, they showed the doubting Northerners the easy possibility of using them thus, but by the same gesture depriving their enemies of their use in just these fields. It was this plain alternative that brought Lee's sudden surrender. Either the South must make terms with its slaves, free them, use them to fight the North, and thereafter no longer treat them as bondsmen, or they could render to the North with the assumption that the North, after the war, must help them to defend slavery, as it had before. George Rawig, a sociologist and anthropologist, describes the development of blacks up and into the Civil War. The slaves went from being frightened human beings thrown among strange men, including fellow slaves who were not their kinsmen and who did not speak their language or understand their customs and habits, on what W. E. Du Bois once described as a general strike whereby hundreds of thousands of slaves deserted the plantations, destroying the Smith's ability to supply its army. Black women played an important part in the war, especially toward the end. Sojourner Truth, the legendary ex-slave who had been active in the women's rights movement, became recruiter of black troops for the Union Army, as did Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin of Boston. Harriet Tubman raided plantations, leading blacks and white troops, and in one expedition freed 750 slaves. Women moved with colored regiments, husbands, enduring terrible hardships on the South, long military treks, in which many children died. They suffered the fate of soldiers, as in April 1864, when Confederate troops at Fort Pillow, Kentucky, massacred Union soldiers, who had surrendered black and white, along with women and children, and in the adjoining camp. As has been said, that black acceptance of slavery is proved by the fact that during the Civil War, when there were opportunities for escape, most slaves stayed on the plantation. In fact, 500,000 ran away, about 1 in 5. A high proportion when one considers that there was great difficulty in knowing where to go and how to live. The owner of a large plantation in South Carolina, Georgia, wrote in 1862, quote, "This war has taught us the perfect impossibility of placement. Esteemed the most have been the first to desert us." End quote. That same year, Lieutenant in the Confederate Army and once mayor of Savannah, Georgia, wrote, quote, "I deeply regret to learn that the Negroes still continue to desert to the enemy." End quote. A minister in Mississippi wrote in the fall of 1862, quote, "On my arrival, was surprised to hear that our Negroes stampeded to the Yankees last night, or rather a portion of them. I think every one, but with one or two exceptions, will go to the Yankees. Eliza and her family are certain to go. She does not conceal her thoughts, but plainly manifest her opinions by her conduct, insolent and insulting." End quote. And a Woman's Plantation, Journal of January 1865. The people are all idle on the plantations, most of them seeking their own pleasure. Many servants have proved faithful, others false and rebellious, against all authority and restraint. Their condition is one of perfect anarchy and rebellion. They have placed themselves in perfect antagonism to their own owners and to all government and control. Nearly all those home servants have left their homes, and for most of the plantations, they have gone at a body. Also, in 1865, a South Carolina planter wrote to the New York Tribune that the conduct of the Negro and the late crisis of our affairs has convinced me that we were all laboring under delusion. I believed that these people were content, happy, and attached to their masters, but events and reflections have caused me to change this position. If they were content, happy, and attached to their masters, why did they desert him in the moment of his need and flock to an enemy, whom they did not know, and thus felt they're perhaps really good masters, whom they did know from the infancy. Genovese notes that the war produced no general rising of slaves, but, quote, in Lafayette County, Mississippi, slaves responded to the Emancipation Proclamation by driving out their overseers and dividing the land and implements among themselves, end quote. Aptheker reports on a conspiracy of Negroes in Arkansas in 1861 to kill their enslavers. In Kentucky that year, houses and barns were burned by Negroes, and in the city of Newcastle, slaves paraded through the city, quote, singing political songs and shouting for Lincoln, end quote. According to newspaper accounts, after the Emancipation Proclamation, a Negro waiter in Richmond, Virginia, was arrested for leading a, quote, servile plot. While in Yazoo City, Mississippi, slaves burned the courthouse and 14 homes. There were special moments. Robert Smalls, later a South Carolina congressman, and other blacks took over a steamship, the Planter, and sailed it past the Confederate guns to deliver it to the Union Army. Most slaves neither submitted nor rebelled. They continued to work, waiting to see what happened. When opportunity came, they left, often joining the Union Army. 200,000 blacks were in the Army and Navy, and 38,000 were killed. Historian James McPherson says, quote, without their help, the North cannot have won the war. As soon as it did, and perhaps it cannot have won at all, end quote. What happened to blacks in the Union Army in the northern cities during the war gave some hint of how limited the Emancipation Proclamation would be. Even with full victory of the Confederacy, off-duty black soldiers were attacked in northern cities, as in Zanesville, Ohio, in February 1864, where cries were heard to, quote, kill the nigger. Black soldiers were used for the heaviest and dirtiest work, digging trenches, hauling logs and cannon, loading ammunition, digging wells for white regiments. White privates received 13 a month. Negro privates received 10 a month. Late in the war, a black sergeant of the 3rd South Carolina Volunteers, William Walker, marched his company to his captain's tent and ordered them to stack arms and resign from the army that he had protested against what he considered a breach of contract because of unequal pay. He was court-martialed and shot for mutiny. Finally, in June 1864, Congress passed a law granting equal pay to Negro soldiers. The Confederacy was desperate in that later part of the war, and some of its leaders suggested the slaves more and more an obstacle to their cause. Be enlisted, used, and freed after a number of military defeats. The Confederate Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, wrote in late 1864 to a newspaper editor in Charleston, quote, it is well known that General Lee, who commands so largely the Confederate, with confidence of the people, is strongly in favor of our using the Negroes for defense and emancipating them, if necessary, for that purpose. End quote. One general, Intendant, wrote, quote, if slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. End quote. By early 1865, the pressure had mounted, and in March, President Davis of the Confederacy signed a Negro soldier law, authorizing the enlistment of slaves as soldiers to be freed by consent of their owners and their state governments, but before it had any significant effect, the war was over. Former slaves interviewed by the Federal Writers Project in the 30s recalled the war's end. Susie Melton. I was a young girl, about 10 years old, and we done heard that Lincoln got a turn in the niggers free. Old missus say there wasn't nothing to do. Then a Yankee soldier told someone in Williamsburg that Lincoln done signed the Emancipation. Was winter time, and mighty cold that night, but everybody commenced getting ready to leave. Didn't care nothing about the missus was going to the Union lines, and all that night to niggers, danced and sang right on the cold. Next morning at daybreak we all started out with blankets and clothes and pots and pans, and chickens piled on our backs. 'Cause missus said we couldn't take no horses or carts. As the sun come over the trees, the niggers starting to singing. Son, you'll be here, and I'll be gone. Son, you be here, I'll be gone. Son, you be here, and I'll be gone. Bye-bye, don't grieve after me. Won't give you my place, not for yours. Bye-bye, don't grieve after me, 'cause you'll be here, and I'll be gone. Anna Woods. We wasn't there in Texas long when the soldiers marched, and to tell us that we were free. I remember one woman, she jumped on a barrel and showered. She jumped off and she shouted. She jumped back on again and shouted some more. She kept that up for a long time, just jumping on a barrel and back off again. Annie Mae Weather said, I remember hearing my pa say that when somebody came and hollered, quote, you niggers is free at last. So he just dropped his hoe and said in a queer voice, thank God for that, end quote. The Federal Writers Project recorded an ex-slave named Franz Berry. Niggers be shouting and clapping hands and singing, chillin' running all over the place, beating time and yelling, everybody happy. Sure did some celebration, run to the kitchen and shout in the window, Mammy, don't you cook no more. You's free. You's free. Many Negroes understood that their status after the war, whatever their situation legally, would depend on whether they owned the land they worked on or would be forced to be semi-slaves. For others, in 1863, a North Carolina Negro wrote that, quote, if the strict law of right and justice is to be observed, of African descent, purchased by the invaluable labor of our ancestors, through a life of tears and groans, under the lash and yoke of tyranny, end quote. Abandoned plantations, however, were leased to former planters and to white men of the North. As one colored newspaper said, quote, the slaves were made serfs and chained to the soil, such as the boasted free men. Freedom acquired by the colored man at the hands of the Yankee. Under congressional policy approved by Lincoln, the property confiscated during the war under the Confederate Confiscation Act of July 1862 would refer to the heirs of the Confederate owners. Dr. John Rock, a black physician in Boston, spoke at a meeting, quote, why talk about compensating masters, end quote. Compensate them for what? What do you owe them? What does the slave owe them? What does society owe them? Compensate the master? Is it the slave who ought to be compensated? The property of the South is by right the property of the slave. Some land was expropriated on grounds that taxes were delinquent and sold at auction. Only a few blacks could afford to buy this, and the South Carolina Seal Islands, out of 16,000 acres up for sale in March of 1863, freedmen who pooled their money were able to buy 2,000 acres, the rest being bought by northern investors and speculators. A free man on the islands dictated a letter to a former teacher now in Philadelphia. My dear young missus, do my missus tell Lincoln that we wants land, that this very land that is rich with de sweat, ob de face, and de blood, ob de whack. We could have been by all we want, but they make de lots too big, and cut we out. Do we word come from Mass Lincoln's in the South, that we take out clothing, our claims, and hold on terum, on to plant 'em. And he will see that we got 'em, every man 10 or 20 acre. We too glad we stake out and last, but for the time, for plant desse commissaries, sells to white folks all they best land, where Lincoln. In early 1865, General William T. Sherman held a conference in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 Negro ministers and church officials, mostly former slaves, at which one of them expressed their need, quote, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and till it by labor." 4 days later, Sherman issued, quote, Special Field Order number 15, quote, designated the entire southern coastline, 30 miles inland, for exclusive Negro settlement. Freedmen could settle there, taking no more than 40 acres per family. By June 1865, 40,000 freedmen had moved onto new farms in this area, but President Andrew Johnson, in August 1865, restored this land to the Confederate owners, and the freedmen were forced off, some at bayonet point. Ex-slave Thomas Hall told the Federal Writers Project, quote, "Lincoln got the praise for freeing us, but did he do it? He gave us freedom without giving us any chance to live to ourselves, and we still had to depend on the Southern white man for work, food, and clothing, and held us out of necessary and want in a state of servitude, but little better than slavery." The American government had set out to fight the slave states in 1861, not to end slavery, but to retain the enormous national territory and market and resources. Yet victory required a crusade, and the more blacks determined to make their freedom mean something, more whites, whether Freeman's Bureau officials or teachers in the Sea Island, or carpetbaggers, unquote, with various mixtures of humanitarianism and personal ambition concerned with racial equality. There was also the powerful interest of the Republican Party, and maintaining control of the national government with the prospect of Southern black voters to accomplish this. Northern businessmen, seeing Republican policies are beneficial to them, went along for a while. The result was that brief period after the Civil War, in which Southern Negroes voted, elected blacks to state legislatures and to Congress, introduced free and racially mixed public education to the South. A legal framework was constructed. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any places subject to their jurisdiction," end quote. The 14th Amendment repudiated the pre-war Dred Scott decision by declaring that, quote, "all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens." It also seemed to make a powerful statement for racial equality, severely limiting states' rights. "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law." The 14th Amendment. Now the 15th Amendment said, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States, nor by any state on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude," end quote. Congress passed a number of laws in the state, late 1860s and early 1870s, in the same spirit, laws making it crime to deprive Negroes of the rights, requiring federal officials to enforce those rights, giving Negroes the right to enter contracts and buy property without discrimination. In 1875, a Civil Rights Act allowed the exclusion of Negroes from hotels, theaters, railroads, and other public accommodations. With these laws, with the Union Army in the South as protection and a civilian army of officials in the Freedmen's Bureau to help them, Southern Negroes came forward, voted, formed political organizations, and expressed themselves forcefully on issues important to them. They were hampered in this for several years by Andrew Johnson, vice president under Lincoln, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. At the close of the war, Johnson vetoed bills to help Negroes. He made it easier for Confederate states to come back into the Union without guaranteeing equal rights to blacks. During his presidency, these area returned Southern states and had to code black codes, which made the freed slaves like serfs still working the plantations. For instance, Mississippi in 1865 made it illegal for freedmen slaves to rent or lease farmland and provided for them to work under labor contracts which they could not break under penalty of prison. It also provided that the courts could assign black children under 18 who had no parents or those parents were poor to forced labor, called apprenticeships, with punishments for runaways. Andrew Johnson clashed with senators and congressmen who, in some cases for reasons of justice, and others out of political calculation, supported equal rights and voting for the freedmen. These members of Congress succeeded in impeaching Johnson in 1868, using an excuse that he had violated some minor statute. But the Senate fell one vote short of the two-thirds required to remove him from office, and the presidential election of that year, Republican Ulysses Grant was elected winning by 300,000 votes, with 700,000 Negroes voting, and so Johnson was out an obstacle. Now the Southern states could come back into the Union only by approving the new constitutional amendments. Whatever platform politicians were doing to help their cause, Southern blacks were determined to make the most of their freedom, in spite of their lack of land and resources. A study of blacks in Alabama in the first years after the war by historian Peter Colchin finds that they began immediately reasserting their independence of whites, forming their own churches, becoming politically active, strengthening their family ties, trying to educate their children. Colchin disagrees with the contention of some historians that slavery had created a, quote, Sambo mentality of submission among blacks. Quote, as soon as they were free, they supposedly depended childlike Negroes, beginning like independent men and women. Negroes were now elected to Southern state legislatures, although in all of these they were a minority except in the lower house of the Southern Carolina legislature. A great propaganda campaign was undertaken. North and South, one in which lasted well into the 20th century, and the history textbooks in North American schools to show the blacks were inept, lazy, corrupt, and ruinous to the government of the South. Where they were in office, undoubtedly there was corruption, but one could hardly claim that blacks had invented political conniving, especially in the bizarre climate of financially finagling North and South after the Civil War. It was true that the public debt of South Carolina, $7 million in 1865, went up to $29 million in 1873, but the new legislature introduced free public schools for the first time into the state. Not only were 70,000 Negro children going to school by 1876, who none had gone before, but 50,000 were white children were going to school, where only 20,000 had attended in 1860. Black voting in the period after 1869 resulted in the two Negro members of the U.S. Senate, Hiram Reveals and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi, and 20 congressmen, including 8 from Southern Carolina, 4 from North Carolina, and 3 from Alabama, and 1 each from the former Confederate States. This list would dwindle rapidly after 1876. The last black led to Congress in 1901. A Columbia University scholar of the 20th century, John Burgess, referred to the black Reconstruction as follows: and placed the government by the most intelligent and virtuous part of the people for the benefit of the governed. Here was government by the most ignorant and vicious part of the population. A black skin means membership in a race of men, which he has never of itself succeeded in objection passion to reason, has never therefore created civilization of any kind. One has to measure against those words to black leaders in the post-war South. For instance, Henry McNeil Turner, who had escaped from peonage on his South Carolina plantation at the age of 15, taught himself to read and write, read law books with a messenger in a lawyer's office in Baltimore, and medical books with a handyman in a Baltimore medical school. Served as chaplain to a Negro regiment, and then was elected to the first post-war legislature of Georgia. In 1868, The Georgia legislature voted to expel all of its Negroes members. 2 senators, 25 representatives, and Turner spoke to the Georgia House of Representatives. A black woman graduate, student at Atlanta University, later brought his speech to lightly. Mr. Speaker, I wish the members of this House to understand the position that I take. I hold that I am a member of this body. Therefore, sir, I shall neither fawn or cringe before any party nor stoop to beg them for my rights. I am here to demand my rights and to hurl thunderbolts at the men who dare to cross that threshold of my manhood. The scene presented in this House today is one unparalleled in the history of the world. Never in the history of the world has a man been arraigned before any body clothed with legislature, judicial, executive, functions, and has remained for the state of Georgia in the very heart of the 19th century to call a man before the bar and therefore charge him with an act for which he is no more responsible than for the head of which he carries upon his shoulders. The Anglo-Saxon race, sir, is a most surprising time. One, I was not aware that there was in the character of that race so much cowardice or so much pusillanimity. I tell you, sir, that is a question which will not die today. This event shall be remembered by posterity for ages yet to come, and while that psalm shall continue to climb the hills of heaven. We are told that if black men want to speak, they must speak through white trumpets. If black men want their sentiments expressed, they must be adulterated and sent through white messengers, who will quibble and advocate and evade as rapidly as the pendulum of a clock. That's a great question, sir, is this: am I a man? If I am such, I claim the rights of man. Why, sir, then? Why, sir, that we are not white, we have accomplished such. We have pioneered a civilization here. We have built up your country. We have worked in your fields and garnered your harvest for 250 years. And what do we ask for you in return? Do we ask for you for compensation for the sweat our fathers before you? For the tears you have caused, and the heart you have broken, and the lives you have curtailed, and the blood you have spilled? Do we retaliation? We ask it not. We are willing to let the dead past bury is dead. But we ask you now for our rights. As black children went to school, they were encouraged by teachers, black and white, to express themselves freely. Sometimes, and catch some style, the wreckage of a school in Louisville, Kentucky. Teacher, now children, you don't think white people are any better than you because they have straight hair and white faces? No, sir. No, they are not better. But they are different. They possess great power. They form this great government. They control this vast country. Now what makes them different from you? Money. Teacher, yes. But what enabled them to obtain this? How did they get money? Students? Got it off us. Stow it. Off we all. Black women helped rebuild the post-war South. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born free in Baltimore, self-supporting from the age of 13, working as a nursemaid, later as an abolitionist lecturer, reader of her own poetry, spoke all through the southern states after the war. She was a feminist participant in the 1866 Women's Rights Convention and founded the National Association of Colored Women. In the 1890s, she wrote the first novel published by a black woman, Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted. In 1878, she described what she had seen and heard recently in the South. An acquaintance of mine who lives in South Carolina, who has been engaged in mission work, reports that in supporting the family women are the mainstay, the 2/3 of the truck gardening and done. By them in South Carolina, that of the city, are more industrious than the men. When the men lose their work through political affiliations, the women stand by them and say, quote, stand by your principles, unquote. Through all the struggles to gain equal rights for blacks, certain black women spoke out in their special situation. Sojourner Truth, at a meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, said, there's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights, and not colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be masters over the women, and will be just as bad as it was before. So I am keeping for the thing going. Well, things are stirring, because if we wait till it is still, it will take a great while to get going again. I am above 80 years old. It's about time for me to be going. I have been 40 years a slave and 40 years free, and would be 40 years more to have equal rights at all. I suppose I am kept here because something remains for me to do. I suppose I am yet to help break the chain. I have done a great deal of work, as much as a man, but not get so much for pay. I used to work in the field and bring grain, keeping with the cradler, and the man doing no more. Got twice as much pay. I suppose I am about the only colored woman that goes about speak for the rights of the colored woman. I want to keep them things stirring, now that ice is cracked. The constitutional amendments were passed, the laws for racial equality were passed, and the black man began to vote and to hold office. But so long as the Negroes remained dependent on privileged whites for work, for necessities of life, his vote could be bought or taken away by threat or force. Thus the laws calling for equal treatment became meaningless. While Union troops, including colored troops, remained in the South, this process was delayed, but the balance of military powers began to change. The Southern white oligarchy used its economic power to organize the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups. Northern politicians began to weigh the advantage of the political support of impoverished blacks, maintained in voting in office only by force, against the more stable situation of a South return to white supremacy. Accepting Republican dominance and business isolation, it was only a matter of time before blacks would be reduced once again to conditions not far from slavery. Violence began almost immediately with the end of the war. In Memphis, Tennessee, in May of 1866, whites on a rampage of murder killed 46 Negroes, most of them veterans of the Union Army, as well as 2 white supremacy sympathizers. 5 Negro women were raped. 90 homes, 12 schools, and 4 churches were burned. In New Orleans in the summer of 1866, another riot began against blacks, killed 35 Negroes and 3 whites. Miss Sarah Song testified before Congressional Investigation Committee. Have you been a slave? I have been a slave. What'd you see of the rioting? I see them kill my husband. It was on Tuesday night between 10 and 11 o'clock. He was shot in the head while he was in bed sick. There's between 20 and 30 men. They came to the room. Then one stepped back and shot him, but it was not a yard from Ben. But he put the pistol to his head and shot him 3 times. Then one of them kicked him and another shot him again. When he was down, he never spoke after the fall. They went running right off and did not come back again. The violence mounted through the late 1860s and early 1870s as the Ku Klux Klan organized raids, lynchings, beatings, burnings. For Kentucky alone, between 1867 and 1871, the National Archives listed 116 acts of violence, a sampling. Number 1. A mob visited Harrodsburg and Mercer County to take from jail a man named Robertson, November 14, 1867. Number 5. Sam Davis hung by a mob in Harrodsburg, May 20, 1868. 6. Wynne Pierce hung by a mob in Christian, July 12, 1868. 7. Geo Roger hung by a mob in Bradsfordville, Martin County, July 11, 1868. 10. Silas Woodford, age 60, badly beaten by a disguised mob. 109. Negro killed by Ku Klux Klan in Hay County, January 14, 1871. 60. A Negro blacksmith named Charles Caldwell, born a slave, later elected to the Mississippi Senate. and known as, quote, a notorious and turbulent Negro, unquote, by whites was shot at by the son of a white Mississippi judge in 1868. Caldwell fired back and killed a man. Tried by an all-white jury, he argued self-defense and was acquitted, the first Negro to kill a white man in Mississippi and go free after jail. But on Christmas Day, 1875, Caldwell was shot to death by a white gang. It was a sign the old white rulers were taking back political power in Mississippi and everywhere else in the South. As white violence rose in the 1870s, the national government, even under President Grant, became less enthusiastic about defending blacks and certainly not prepared to arm them. The Supreme Court played its gyroscopic role of pulling the other branches of government back to more conservative directions when they went too far. It began interpreting the 14th Amendment, passed presumably for racial equality, in a way that made it potent for this purpose. In 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, outlawing discrimination against Negroes using public facilities, was nullified by the Supreme Court, which said, quote, individual invasion of individual rights is not the subject matter of the amendment, unquote. The 14th Amendment, it said, was aimed at state action only, not no state shall, end quote. A remarkable dissent was written by Supreme Court Justice John Harlan, himself a former slave owner in Kentucky, who said there was a constitutional justification for banning private discrimination. He noted that the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, applied to individual plantation owners and not just the state. He then argued that discrimination was a badge of slavery and similarly allowable. He pointed also to the first clause of the 14th Amendment, saying that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, and to the clause in Article 4, Section 2, saying, quote, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to ill privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Harlan was fighting for a force greater than logic or justice. The mood of court reflected a new coalition of northern industrialists and southern businessmen planters. The culmination of this mood came in the decision of 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, when the court ruled that a railroad could segregate black and white if the segregated facilities were equal. The object of the amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social or as distinguished from political equality, or a comingly out of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Harlan again dissented, our Constitution is colorblind, end quote. It was the year 1877 that spelled out clearly and dramatically what was happening. When the year opened, the presidential election of the past November was in bitter dispute. The Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden had 184 votes and needed more and more to be elected. His popular vote was greater by 250,000. The Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes had 166 electoral votes. 3 states had not yet counted and had a total of 119 electoral votes. If Hayes could get all those, he would have 185 and then be president. And that's what his managers proceeded to arrange. They made concessions to the Democratic Party and the White South, including an agreement to remove Union troops from the South and the last military obstacle to the reestablishment of white supremacy there. Northern political and economic interests needed powerful allies and stability in the face of the national crisis. The country had been in economic depression since 1873, and by 1877 farmers and workers were beginning to rebel, as C. Van Woodsworth put it, in his history of the 1877 Compromise, Reunion and Reaction. It was a depression year, the worst year of the severest depression year yet experienced, and the East labor and the unemployed were in a bitter and violent temper. Out west, a tide of agrarian radicalism was rising. From both east and west came threats against the elaborate structure of protective tariffs, national banks, railroad subsidies, and monetary agreements upon which the new economic order was founded. It was a time for reconciliation between southern and northern elites. Woodward asked, quote, could the South be induced to combine with the northern conservatives and become a prop instead of a menace to the new capitalist order? With billions of dollars Were the slaves gone? The wealth of the old South was wiped out. They now looked to the national government to help. For credits, subsidies, flood control projects, the United States in 1865 had spent $103,294,501 on public works, but the South received only $9,469,363. For instance, while Ohio got over $1 million, Kentucky, her neighbor south of the river, only got $25,000. While Maine got $3 million, Mississippi got $136,000. While $83 million had been given to subsidize the Union Pacific and Central Pacific railroads. Such subsidy for the South. So one of the things the South looked for was federal aid to the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Woodward says, quote, by means of appropriations, subsidies, grants, and bonds such as Congress has so lavishly showered upon capitalist enterprise in the North, the South might yet mend its fortunes, or at any rate the fortune of a privileged elite, end quote. These privileges were sought with the backing of the poor, with white farmers brought into the new alliance against blacks. The farmers wanted railroads, harbor improvements, flood control, and of course land, not knowing yet how these be used, not to help them, but to exploit them. For examples, as the first act in the New South Capitalist Cooperation, the Southern Homestead Act, which had reserved all federal lands, 1/3 of the area of Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, for farmers who would work the land, was repealed. This enabled absentee speculators and lumbermen to move in and buy up much of this land. And so the deal was made. The proper committee was set up to bring both houses of Congress to decide whether the electoral vote go to. The decision was they belonged to Hayes, and he was now president. As Woodward sums it up, the Compromise of 1877 did not restore the old order to the South. Ill did assure the dominant whites political autonomy and non-intervention in matters of British policy, promised then a share in the blessings of the new economic order. In return, the South became, in effect, a satellite of the dominant region. The importance of the new capitalism and returning white blacks' power existed in the power source South, as affirmed by Horace Mann, Bond's study of Alabama Reconstruction, which shows after 1868, quote, a struggle between different financiers, end quote. Yes, racism was a factor, but, quote, accumulation of capital and the men who controlled them were unaffected. Attitudinal prejudices, as it is possible to be, without sentiment, without communion, without emotion. Those who sought profit from exploitation of Alabama's natural resources turned other men's prejudices and attitudes to their own account, and did so with skill and a ruthless acumen, end quote. It was an age of coal and power, and northern of Alabama had both. Quote, the bankers in Philadelphia, New York, and even in London and Paris had known this for almost 2 decades. The only thing lacking was transportation, end quote. And so in the middle 1870s, Bond notes northern bankers began appearing in the directories on Southern Railroad lines. James P. Morgan appears by 1875 as director for several lines in Alabama and Georgia. In the year 1886, Henry Grady, an editor of the Atlanta Constitution, spoke at a dinner in New York. In the audience were J.P. Morgan, H.M. Flagler, an associate of Rockefeller, Russell Sage, and Charles Tiffany. His talk was called, quote, the New South, and his theme was, let bygones be bygones. Let us have a new era of peace and prosperity. The Negro is a prosperous laboring class, and he had the fullest protection of the laws and the friendship of the South people. Grady joked about the Northerners who had slaves, who solicited the South and said the South can now handle its own race problems. He received a rising ovation, and the band played, quote, Dixie. That same month, an article in the New York Daily Tribune, the leading coal and iron men of the South who had been in the city during the last 10 days will go home to spend the Christmas holidays. Thoroughly satisfied with the business of that year, more than hopeful for the future. They have good reason for it to be the time for which they have been waiting for nearly 20 years, when northern capitalists would be convinced not only for the safety, but of the immense profits to be gained from the investment of their money in developing the fabulously rich coal and iron resources of Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, has come at last. The Northern must be recalled. Did not have to undergo a revolution to its thinking to accept the subordination of the Negro. When the Civil War ended, 19 of the 24 northern states did not allow blacks to vote. By 1900, all the southern states, and new constitutions and new statutes had written into law the disenfranchisement and segregation of Negroes. And a New York Times editorial said, quote, Northern men no longer denounce the suppression of the Negro vote. the necessity of its under the supreme law of self-preservation is candidly recognized. While not written into law in the North, the counterpart in racist thought and practice was there, an item in the Boston Transcript. September 25th, 1895. Quote, a colored man who gives his name as Henry W. Turner was arrested, but not on suspicion of being a highway robber. He was taken this morning to a black studio where he had his picture taken for the, quote, rogues gallery that angered him, and he made himself as disagreeable as he possibly could. Several times along the way to the photographers, he resisted the police with all his might, and he had to be clubbed. In the post-war literature, images of the Negro came mostly from Southern white writers like Thomas Nelson Page. In his own novel, Red Rock referred to a Negro character as a, quote, hyena in the cage, a reptile, a species of worm, a wild beast, and interspersed with paternalistic upbringings of friendship from the Negro. Joe Chandler Harris, and his Uncle Remus stories, who would have Uncle Remus say, quote, put a spelling book in a nigger's hands and write Dendar. You loses a plow hand. I can take a barrel stave and fling no sense into a nigger in 1 minute. Dan till day. Schoolhouses, Betswicks, des and de stat, middiggin. In this atmosphere, it was no wonder that those Negro leaders most accepted in white society, like the educator Booker T. Washington, at one time White House guest of Theodore Roosevelt, urged Negro political passivity, invited by the white organizers of the Canton States International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. To speak, Washington urged the Southern Negro to, quote, cast down your bucket where you are, that is, to stay in the South, to be farmers and mechanics, domestics, perhaps even to attain to the professions. He urged white employers to hire Negroes rather than immigrants, to, quote, strange tongue and habits. Negroes, quote, without strikes and labor wars, end quote, were the, quote, most passionate, faithful, law-abiding, and unresidential people that the world has ever seen, end quote. He said, quote, the wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality as the extremest folly, end quote. Perhaps Washington saw this as a necessary tactic of survival. In a time of hangings and burnings of Negroes throughout the South, it was a low point of black people in America. Thomas Fortune, a young black editor of the New York Gallo, testified before a Senate committee in 1883 about the situation of the Negro in the United States. He spoke of, quote, widespread poverty, and, quote, of government betrayal, of desperate Negro attempts to educate themselves. The average wage of Negro farm laborers to the South was about 50 cents a day. Fortune said he was usually paid in, quote, orders, not money, which he could only use as a store credit controlled by the planter. Quite a system of fraud, end quote. The Negro farmer, to get the wherewithal to plant the crops, had to promise it to the store, and when everything was added up at the end of the year, he was in debt, so his crop was constantly owed to someone. And when he was tied to the land, and with the records kept by the planter and storekeeper, said the Negroes, quote, are swindled and kept forever in debt, end quote. As for supposed as laziness, quote, I am surprised that a larger number of them do not go to fishing, hunting, and loafing it, end quote. Fortune spoke of the, quote, penitentiary system of the South with its infamous chain gang, the object being to terrorize the blacks and furnish victims for contractors who purchase the labor of these wretches from the States for a song. The white man who shoots a Negro always goes free, while the Negro who steals a hog is sent to the chain gang for 10 years. Many Negroes fled. About 6,000 black people left Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and migrated to Kansas to escape violence and poverty. Frederick Douglass and some other leaders thought this was a wrong tactic, but migrants rejected such advice. Quote, we have found no leader to trust a God overhead of us, end quote. Once at Henry Adams, Another black migrant, later a veteran of the Union Army, told a Senate committee in 1880 why he left Shreveport, Louisiana, quote, "We see that the whole South, every state in the South, had got into the hands of the very man that held his slaves," end quote. Even in the worst periods, Southern Negroes continued to meet. To organize in self-defense, Herbert Aptheker reprints 13 documents of meetings, petitions, and appeals of Negroes in the 1880s in Baltimore, Louisiana, the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and Kansas, showing the spirit of defiance and resistance of all blacks all over the South. This in the face of over 100 lynchings a year by this time. Despite the apparent homelessness of the situation, there were black leaders who thought Booker T. Washington wrong and advocating caution and moderation. John Hope, a young black man in Georgia, who heard Washington's con and exposition speech, told students at Negro College in Nashville, Tennessee, "If we are not striving for equality, in heaven's name, for what are we living? I regard it as cowardly and dishonest for any of our colored men to tell white people, or colored people, that we are not struggling for equality. Yes, my friends, I want equality, nothing less. Now catch your breath, for I am growing. To use an adjective, I am going to say we demand social equality. I am no wild beast, nor am I an unclean thing. Rise, brothers, come let us possess this land. Be discontented, be dissatisfied, be as restless as the tempest billows on the boundless sea, lest your discontent break a mountain high against the wall of prejudice and swamp it to the very foundation." Another black man who came to teach at Atlanta University, W.E. Du Bois, saw the late 19th century betrayal of the Negro as part of a larger began happening in the United States. Something happening not only to poor blacks, but to poor whites. In his book Black Reconstruction, written in 1935, he said, quote, "God wept, but that mattered little to the unbelieving age. What mattered most was that the world wept, and still is weeping and blind with tears and blood, for there began to rise in America in 1876 a new capitalism and a new enslavement of labor. Du Bois saw the new capitalism as part of a process of exploitation, and bribery taking place in all the quote, civilized countries of the world. Home labor in cultured lands, appeased and misled by ballot whose power the dictatorship of vast capital strictly curtailed, was bribed by high wage and political office to unite in exploration of white, yellow, brown, and black labor in lesser lands." Was Du Bois right that in the growth of American capitalism before and after the Civil War, whites as well as blacks were in some sense becoming slaves? And that's the end question. Thank you guys for tuning in to Chapter 10. I'm at Chapter 9. Hope you guys enjoyed it and learned a thing or two. And have a great day.